Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. This is our last lecture of the end-of-life bioethics course in the Masters in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you. We thank you for your many blessings, Lord, in spite of the difficulties and challenges of life. We know that you are with us, that you walk with us every step of the way. We ask your Holy Spirit to illumine our hearts and minds during this lecture and throughout our lives, always to discern your will in our lives, Lord, that we may be able to delve into these fundamental bioethical principles that we use to help us make these critical decisions between life and death, as we seek your guidance and your inspiration in these bioethical issues, especially toward the end of human life. And as we continue to form our conscience and grow in knowledge of these issues, that we may be able to share this knowledge with those who surround us, especially at critical moments of their life, loved ones, or even just other people who consult with us. We ask your mercy always in those who are in most need of your divine mercy at this time. This we ask in the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Okay, any questions or comments from previous lectures? Anything? Okay, well, if there's nothing, then we're going to move forward. We're going to look at three fundamental principles that are used in Catholic bioethics. First, the sources of morality, the three sources of ethical decision-making, all right? The three sources or fonts of ethical decision-making. Then the principle of double effect, and finally, cooperation with evil. And I can tell you the past few months, because of the development of the coronavirus vaccines, this issue of cooperation with evil has been on the forefront. And I cannot tell you how many consults I have received, calls, phone, email, you name it, with regards to whether to take the vaccines or not, and which vaccine to take, etc. So this principle of cooperation with evil has been very evident in the past few months, not only here in the United States, but even throughout the world, to the point that the Vatican actually released a statement on this, an official statement on the vaccines. Okay, so we'll get to it. All right, before looking at these fundamental principles that we use in bioethics, I just want to recap that they are based on the intrinsic dignity of the human person. I have here a little slide that is from last semester, yes, from the course on fundamental principles in bioethics, right? And where we did that phylogenetic origin of the human species, and we looked at the biblical narrative of the creation of man, the human, where it says in the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, that God has created us in his image. Remember that in Hebrew, we read from right to left. Many ancient writings are from right to left. And said, God, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And associated with that image and likeness is a power and authority, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the livestock and everything, every living creature on earth. So being God's image gives us a certain authority over nature that the rest of the species don't have. And we'll see a little bit how that authority, that power comes about specifically in two faculties that we have that distinguish us as humans from the rest of the living species that are on Earth. Okay. So we have this issue of Imago Dei, which is just a Latin, it's a little Latin phrase that has been used for centuries, actually millennia, that we are God's image, Imago Dei, all right, God's image. We can ask the question, how is it that we are God's image? Just recapping a little bit what we covered last semester, which is we're not God's image by way of our corporeal being, our physical body, because our physical body is composite, it's made of parts, right? We looked at the hierarchy of organ systems in the body, the hierarchy of life, of organic life. And we said that our body is made up of organ systems, precisely about a dozen organ systems, depending on how they're classified. The circulatory system, digestive system, nervous system, etc. And each one of those systems is made up of organs, some of which are vital, other organs are not vital, but all necessary for functioning one way or another, for being alive here on Earth, right? So systems are made up of organs, organs are made up of tissues, tissues are made up of cells, and the cell is the basic unit of organic life, of life on Earth, but we can go smaller than the cell also because we know the cell is made up of organelles, and those organelles are made up of molecules, the organic macromolecules that make up the living world. And those molecules are made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of subatomic particles, and even those subatomic particles, the three basic subatomic particles, the proton, the neutron, and the electron themselves are made up of smaller units called quarks, and then we get into quantum mechanics and all that. My point with doing all this is that definitely we are composite beings. We're made up of parts, right? So that means that we're not simple. We're not simple, we are composite, philosophically and theologically speaking. In contrast with God, who is simple. God has no parts. God is what we call a simple being, unique, that is not made up of parts. Okay? And so we're not God's image by way of our physical being. How is it then that we are God's image? Well, to cut to the chase, basically by two specific faculties that we have that are unique to the human species, which is the intellect and the will, the intellect and the will, all right? In our capacity for reasoning and in our capacity for willing, for choosing freely, right? These two capacities pretty much connect us, make us God's image. In other words, there is a divine intellect that we say God is omniscient, right? Omniscient, meaning that God knows everything. And God is also omnipotent, and God is all powerful. And so we talk about the divine intellect and the divine will. God also has a will, in other words, that he has a desire for creation to be. Notice that for God to be truly God, he cannot be coerced or forced into anything, right? And therefore, creation is also a free activity of God. God desired to create the universe and everything that is in it, including our planetary system and life on Earth and the human being specifically. And therefore, that flows out of God's will. And we have also a human will. And in the measure that we align our human will with God's will, then we are really fulfilling this vision or this definition of being God's image, all right? So the fact that God has given us this intellect, reason, to be able to understand nature and also to manipulate nature. For example, the whole process of agriculture and animal husbandry. In other words, to use nature for our advantage, to generate more food one way or another, so that we don't have to continue living as hunter-gatherers, which were the most primitive humans around. We can now benefit and profit from the art and science of agriculture and animal husbandry, so that we can generate food for our sustenance. In fact, it's estimated that we generate globally about 4 times the amount of food that is needed to maintain all the people of the world, the almost 8 billion people that we are, all right? We generate about 4 times as much food as is needed to keep everyone alive, to feed everyone. And that production of food is happening mostly in the developed countries because of the advanced agriculture and animal husbandry that we have set in practice, a great bit because of the technology that we have, all right? Now, just to stay on that one, another little datum that I have picked up along the way, reading here and there, is that about half of the world's population goes to bed hungry every day, about half of the world's population. So that huge inequality, how is it that we overproduce food, and yet people are still going hungry in this world, all right? Well, a lot has to do, it's an extremely complicated issue, but it has to do, bottom line, in my mind, with a lot, not totally, but a lot with corruption. In other words, that the food doesn't get to the people that need it the most. And well, the market economy is such that we need to pay for our food and water and drink. And many people don't have sufficient funds to do that. And the whole infrastructure of getting food to people is a complicated thing, really, the whole network of getting food to the local table from the production, wherever that food is being produced, right, in the fields. So anyway, I want to say also with that, that the 4 times as much food that we produce in the world, about half of that is lost either to critters like mice and other insects that go into the granaries and into the food storage and just eat it up, all right? Because many of these places are not totally secure. Again, in developing countries, the infrastructure is much weaker and unstable and old, etc., and primitive. So many other animals are feeding, wild animals, are feeding on the food that we produce, okay? About half of it is lost to that, and also to contamination with bacteria or fungi. They rot, essentially, because that food is not refrigerated, etc. And so we lose about half of that production to other creatures here on Earth, right? But still, that leaves still twice as much food to feed all of the people of the world. And so there's a lot to do there with regards to conscience and development of conscience to try to get this food to the people who are in need. Just recently, for example, I read a little article on North Korea. North Korea is at the brink of going through another starvation phase. They went through a starvation phase a few decades ago, and it decimated the population. I think there was about 3 million people died in North Korea, starved to death because of one of these bouts of starvation. What is happening there, as you know, is a dictatorial regime, and the dictator there has decided to put the vast majority of the resources of the country into a nuclear arsenal, a nuclear armament, and military infrastructure, way beyond anything that would be needed for national defense for a small country like that. At any rate, that megalomaniac idea has essentially brought the population to starvation. And he himself made that declaration, which was very rare and unique for him to admit that North Korea is about to go into another starvation phase of who knows how many million people. And I think it's kind of a pitch to the industrialized world or to the developed world to all of a sudden have pity on them and start pumping in their resources to avoid that human tragedy. Okay, but that's just one example, and that was in the news maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago. So it's not something historical or ancient. It's a relevant issue today. Anyway, I don't know why I got into that, but basically, oh yes, so the human intellect has given us a tremendous capacity to control and manipulate nature, all right? Now, we also have to be careful that that control and that manipulation is not to destroy nature. We have to understand this dominion rule, as in the original Hebrew, to rule doesn't mean to destroy, but rather to preserve and conserve. In other words, stewardship. Okay, again, part of that agriculture is that it goes into natural habitats, and especially primary agriculture and secondary agriculture, which is basically slash and burn, cut down the forest, burn it down and make an agricultural field out of it with primitive means whereby they depend mostly on rainwater for the actual irrigation and so forth. So that kind of agriculture is very, very damaging to the environment, and it eats up a lot of land, natural habitats, to the point that I can tell you today, the greatest threat to biodiversity, and we're facing into this sixth extinction. There is evidence of 5 extinction events on Earth since life began, from the fossil record and other evidence, and we're heading towards a 6th extinction. The rate of extinction right now is about 100 times greater than the baseline extinction rate of species. There's always an extinction rate of species going on. In other words, new species are evolving. Speciation is going on slowly but surely due to natural selection, right? We covered that also in the first semester. And also there is an extinction rate that is kind of a background extinction rate to make what is known as a steady state where new species are arising and other species are dying off, the ones that are less adapted and so forth. So there's a background extinction rate always in nature on Earth. But now, in the past few decades, we have accelerated that extinction rate so that right now it's about 100 times greater than the background extinction rate, all right? So that means that we're heading toward a mass extinction. And if we don't curb this soon, it will happen. It will happen, all right? Now, a lot of the main factor in this new extinction rate is habitat loss. Unlike previous extinction rates or previous mass extinctions that has been mostly a dramatic change in the climate, all right? A dramatic climate change has brought about mass extinctions in the past, again, from not only the fossil record, but geological evidence also of these catastrophic events that happen on Earth several times over the past billions of years. But this one is more due to habitat loss. Habitat loss, in other words, natural wild places where wildlife would survive and thrive. Plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, protozoans, all right? Where the wildlife would naturally thrive is natural habitat. Well, loss of natural habitat is the greatest threat to life on Earth right now, more so than climate change, because even though climate change may be happening, and there's good proof of that also, it's more longer term. It's longer term, all right? And it takes a little longer to affect that change and for that climate change to have an impact on life on Earth. But much more dramatic than that is loss of habitat. And there's a general sequence that follows from a natural habitat, let's a forest, a grassland, you name it. That natural habitat will be first invaded by agriculture, mostly an agricultural field, again, to cut down a forest, to make an agricultural field out of it, all right? That's a dramatic loss in natural habitat. But still, a few species may still be able to adapt and survive in the agricultural field. Some wildlife will still live there, but very, very reduced from the original biodiversity that would have been in that forest in the same place. And eventually, that agricultural field may be replaced with urbanization, with urban development, all right? With urban development. We have seen that in Miami-Dade County. We've seen it in Florida, especially the two coasts of Florida have become urbanized. One can go, for example, from Palm Beach County on I-95, say, heading south, and you'd go through 3 counties. You go through Palm Beach County, you go through Broward County, and you go through Miami-Dade County, and you cannot really tell where the boundary is, the boundary between one county and another. It's one huge urban development through 3 entire counties, all right? And even though there are different cities and municipalities, still going through in a sweep like that on the expressway, one cannot tell just by looking at the surrounding area from one county to another because everything is urbanized. And that's not the half of it. That stays small when we compare the Northeast, for example, the whole New England area, practically just north of Washington, D.C. You get on 95 and you go north and it's basically one large urban area also that actually goes through entire states. The same argument can be made, a similar argument on the West Coast and on the West Coast of Florida, all urbanized, and little by little that urbanization has been moving into the county. We see into the state, we see that particularly in the central part of the state with Disney World and that whole area in Orlando, how it has been developed tremendously. And the corridor, what is called the technological corridor, connecting basically the West Coast with the East Coast, I-4, Interstate 4, which cuts right across the middle of Florida, the state of Florida, how little by little all that is being urbanized, okay? So this issue of urban development is a big, huge challenge because it's inversely proportional to biodiversity, okay? We'll see this in greater detail next semester when we get into the environmental bioethics course. But for now, I leave it out there that it is a big challenge and we have to understand that this rule over the earth, over the creatures of the earth, and in other translations is have dominion, which is even a worse translation, is not to destroy the rest of the planet, but rather to be stewards of the planet, to be stewards of the planet. And the big challenge here is that we have to live somewhere. Physically, we have to live somewhere. We cannot live out in thin air, you know, in great amounts. There are people living out in the International Space Station, but it's a very, very small population, maybe up to a dozen scientists. I don't really know how many, but certainly not the 8 billion that we are, okay? So we have to live somewhere, and how to live in harmony with the nature that surrounds us. That is really the big environmental bioethics challenge of the century. Okay, is how to live in harmony with the rest of nature that surrounds us so that we minimize our footprint and our footprint is not as damaging as it is right now. All right, so how is it that we are God's image? We have the intellect and the will, and the intellect has allowed us to dominate nature, all right? to the point of domesticating even plants and animals, many more plants than animals. We have not been too successful in domesticating animals, much more successful in domesticating plants. And the will, of course, is that what is driving our intellect either to the good or to the bad. So our will is the one that chooses ethically. When we look at the will ethically, then it chooses between right or wrong behavior, all right? And there is a challenge then, that's the bioethics that comes in because of the exercise of our will, which again is distinct from the rest of nature, that they have instinct and they rule by instinct. And that's why when a tiger kills, well, let's say when a lion kills a zebra in the African savannah, we don't put that lion into prison, right, for killing a zebra, because that is instinct and that's part of the selective process. All right, so that is as background, basically, which is the dignity and the sanctity that comes to us by reason of being God's image. And the responsibility that comes to us also in the exercise of our intellect and our will here on earth, so that we don't destroy the earth. And even for selfish reasons, destroying the rest of the earth will destroy us in the process, because it doesn't take too long to realize that whereas the rest of nature can live without us, without the human species, we certainly cannot live without the rest of nature, okay? And therefore, even for selfish reasons, it behooves us to care for the rest of creation. And these principles and the whole issue of bioethics helps us to make these wise decisions, hopefully, allows us to elaborate wisdom and to apply that wisdom and that maturity and responsibility to our lives, to our behavior, our conduct. All right, so that's the background. Now let's get into these three basic principles. One is the sources of morality or ethics. I mean, here there are two words that are kind of interchangeable. When we talk about morality, typically it's more looking at it from the theological perspective, whereas when we talk about ethics, we're looking at human behavior from the philosophical perspective, right? So basically it has to do with human behavior, what is right or wrong human behavior. However, it means that when we talk about morality, typically it has some kind of a religious component. And so it's not just sexual morality, there's also social morality, for example, all right? We behave in society and so forth. But typically morality involves some kind of a spiritual component to it, or religious, or considering that we are precisely God's image, and that it's a little more explicit, the fact that God is with us and watching us, etc. Whereas ethics, since ethics is one of the 5 branches of philosophy, we can talk about ethics also in the secular arena. And that's why we talk about bioethics and not biomorality, because in bioethics, we can then engage with the society that surrounds us, which is mostly secular, all right? It's mostly a secular society. We see that utilitarianism rules, whether consciously or not, in the minds and in the hearts of many, many people. And therefore, to try to engage in a dialogue with a contemporary society, ethics is more useful, because we can do ethics without having to make an explicit mention of God or the divine or any particular religion or spirituality. We can maintain it at the philosophical level, at the reasonable level, at the level of a reasonable argument, okay? And that's why we talk about bioethics and not biomorality. At any rate, for the purpose of study, there are 3 sources or 3 fonts of human behavior, of human moral or ethical behavior. So these are interchangeable words, sources or fonts, morality or ethics. practically speaking, all right? And the three sources are the moral object, the intentions, and the circumstances. Now, these sources or fonts are subdivided this way in three parts for the purpose of study. But we have to understand that they occur simultaneously. In other words, when we're acting, all of these are involved in our human behavior, all right? All these aspects are involved simultaneously in our human behavior. We separate them like this simply for the purpose of study. Okay, so let's look at each one individually. And by the way, this way of looking at the human acts that are human behavior, whether it's moral or not, whether it's ethical or not behavior, right? This analysis allows us to do what we call an objective morality. In other words, to pass judgment on certain actions without passing judgment on the conscience of the person, so that we can say objectively, murder is wrong, adultery is wrong, should always be avoided. And that's when we talk about intrinsic evils. Intrinsic evil is an evil act that should always be avoided, always and everywhere, all right? And we can do that kind of objective morality precisely because of this moral object, the moral object, which actually I'll leave for the last. I'll cover the other two first because they're a little simpler to understand. But basically, these three aspects of human behavior respond to certain questions, okay, to some key questions. The intention responds to the question, why? Why are we doing whatever we're doing, all right? Why are we doing whatever we're doing? And so you see that it is subjective. It is subjective. It's within the conscience, the heart of the person. Why am I doing something? All right? And so it is subjective. And therefore, the why, only we know really internally what is our motivation for doing things. So for example, an act of charity, or giving some of my money or some of my material goods to someone else, all right? Just giving someone else something is an act of charity. Now, that charity, I could do it for a number of intentions. I could do it because of generosity, because I want to help someone else, all right? Or I could do it because I want to have some attention drawn to me, or because I want to lower my tax bracket, right? It depends on the intention, which is subjective. And at the end of the day, no one really knows our intentions except two people. There are two persons who always know our intentions, ourselves and God, because God has access to our conscience, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be God. So he knows what our intentions, even before we have them. And we hopefully are aware of our intentions also. Sometimes we're not fully aware of our intentions. That can be a problem. So we need to thematize, we need to bring forth our intentions and be honest with ourselves. Why is it really that I am giving something to someone else? Is it because of generosity, or is it because of some other motivation? Okay, I'm trying to get the attention of that other person, etc. That happens sometimes when people are dating each other, okay? They're trying to get the attention of the other person, so they will give that person something. But in their heart of hearts, they may be expecting a return in kind, like they say, a return in kind. All right, so the intention is definitely subjective, and it resides in the human conscience within the person. All right, and we don't pass judgment on the intentions of people because we don't get into the conscience of people. We don't pass judgments of the intentions, all right? However, okay, and then the circumstances also respond to some questions here. Let's see. Where, when, and where, when,
Professor, I have a question.
Yep.
You said that we can't pass judgment on someone's intention, but in the case of Terry Schiavo, when with her husband,
Yes.
we questioned his intentions. So are those not the same?
Well, we did question it, but we did not, at the end of the day, we did not pass judgment on that intention. Remember, his intentions were questionable simply because of his behavior. What we were seeing objectively, that he started a second relationship without divorcing Terry, right? And so he was still legally married. He was still legally married to her. However, if in his mind he had moved on from that marriage, why didn't he divorce her? And we can also ask the other lady, didn't she deserve to be married to Michael before having that child? You know, because that child now was born out of wedlock. And we can say that objectively, there was a certain injustice there. Of course, the other lady consented to that one way or another. We assume that it was not forced, that she was not forced. And yet there was a certain level of injustice in that she did not have a legitimate marriage with Michael. If he had thought in his mind moving on because he can no longer have a marital relationship with Terry, you know, why not divorce her? So it puts into question his motivations and the fact that there was that inheritance in the background, right? Which may have been up to $1 million. If Terry died, he would inherit as husband. But if he divorced, then no one would inherit. It would go back to the insurance company because there was no, Terry had not assigned an inheritor. She had not done a will or a living will, okay? But even just a property will. You follow? So there was a question. However, I also said very clearly, and you can go back to the recording if you wish, that bracketing his infidelity, bracketing, which, by the way, that's a good example of the moral object, okay? We can say objectively that he was unfaithful. We can say that there was an infidelity, that there was adultery going on. And yet, people are not arrested by adultery, okay? So it's strictly an ethical thing. We know that it's not illegal. It's not illegal to be an adulterer, but hopefully we can all agree that it's certainly unethical, all right? But bracketing that unethical behavior, could it be that he still had an interest in carrying out Terry's wishes? In other words, that conversation that they had, that he claims they had, because apparently there were no witnesses from that conversation. It happened years before. I don't even know if they were already married or they were engaged. I think they were, he claimed, I don't remember exactly, but he claimed it happened while they were already married. But I do remember from the statements that it was one evening, they were having dinner at a restaurant somewhere, and the conversation came up. Somehow, maybe it was in the news about vegetative state, someone else, and they talked about it. He claims that they talked about it, and Terry said, I would not want to live that way, okay? So those were her wishes, but there was nothing written. So we have to go by what Michael said. So what I said precisely in last lecture was, his infidelity aside, you know, could it be that he was saying the truth about Terry's wishes? All right. And is it reasonable? Is it reasonable? And the conclusion that I made is that yes, it is reasonable because we reverted the question to ourselves. What if we were in Terry's shoes, as it were, or in Terry's predicament of being in a vegetative state? We can project with our minds, hypothetically, if we were Terry in that vegetative state for years, all right, with the clinical declaration of doctors, of several doctors, that there was no hope for the recovery, that she was truly in vegetative state and it was irreversible. Even after undergoing that experimental treatment of the brain stimulator in California and had failed, and many therapies had failed, you know, there was really no hope of recovery for years. You know, who of us would really honestly want to live that way? Okay, so this is subjective. This is a subjective question. I can tell you in my mind, in my conscience, I would not want to live that way if there was no hope of recovery. What am I doing here? Especially in the face of a belief in an afterlife, in a glorified body where there is no more PVS, okay? And so if I am true and honest to my beliefs in an afterlife that is glorious in the presence of God for all eternity, what am I doing here in a PVS state, right? And so I can say for sure, and you are witnesses to this, even though I do have a living will, that I would not want to live that way. So it's reasonable to assume that Terry would not want to live that way either. In other words, Michael, his infidelity aside, was presenting a reasonable argument, okay? And not only the infidelity, also the desire for the inheritance. Could be, you know, is he doing it because he wants to inherit? Well, who knows? We're not passing judgment on his intentions, all right?
We're just laying it out. Okay, got it.
Hello? And
yeah, got it. We're just laying out the different facts and being
yes,
subjective within each idea.
exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
We have to lay out the facts first, okay? And this was, and I emphasize this also, we're not revealing anything confidential from Michael here because he was openly in that relationship. He had been seen in restaurants with the child and introducing other people to his new partner, you know, and so forth. So it was in the open. It was in the open. In other words, we can see that existentially he had moved on from Terry's relationship, and he was only maintaining that husbandry, you know, to fulfill her wishes so that he could be the legal proxy, especially because the parents, I mean, if the parents had been in agreement, maybe, who knows, maybe if the parents had been in agreement of disconnecting Terry, maybe he would have divorced her. He would have lost the inheritance, okay, but he would have been at least honest to Terry's wishes. Now she's disconnected, so I can move on to the other relationship. All right, but it could still be, one could make an argument that he still had Terry's best intentions in mind, all right? Of course, the judges have to go by the legal facts. And if he's still the husband, even if he's in 20 other relationships, you know, he is still the proxy, okay, by law. So that's all that the judges need to go by. They need to go by the law. Mm-hmm. All right, so circumstances where, when, and also, now the moral object, we understand that circumstances could be under duress and circumstances could be out of ignorance, for example, that I don't really know the facts. I make that argument in the other course, as you remember, at the beginning of life, especially for a number of women, pregnant moms who, particularly if they're young, they feel stressed about the pregnancy. They don't really know that is a full life because they didn't pay attention in their high school biology class that taught them that life begins at fertilization for whatever species, including the human, or a typical reaction. I'll tell you because I've been with the introduction of sonogram to pregnancy, right? And to determine the stage of the pregnancy and so forth. It's a clinical aid, and now it's standard procedure to do a sonogram on a pregnant mom. When that sonogram is shown to the pregnant mom, the typical reaction, especially if it's the first pregnancy, right? The typical reaction is, wow, I didn't know it was that human. I didn't know it was that human, okay? And that expression portrays a certain level of ignorance because we're not more or less human. Philosophically, we're human or non-human. In other words, we belong to the human species or not. We can say, wow, I didn't know he or she was that developed, right? Or undeveloped, but human is an all or none category. Humanity, we either human or non-human. Because if we put a gradation on humanity, you know, if we can validate, if we can say that that is a true statement, that is a philosophically correct, a logically correct statement. I didn't know it was that human. means that the unborn is not as human as the born, then it means that some people are more human than others. By analogy, we could then say, if the unborn is not as human as the born, then we can say a baby is not as human as a teenager, and a teenager is not as human as an adult, which is false. It's false, right? It's false reasoning. So we are human or non-human, all or none category. And that's precisely the argument with regards to the unborn. They are as human as we are. They're obviously in an early stage of development. They're nowhere near as developed as we are, but they are definitely human, all right? So, so even the circumstances could be ignorance, which mitigates the culpability of the person, even to the point of having no culpability at all. So that's why typically who I blame in the case of procured abortions is the abortionist, the doctor who has certainly studied embryology in detail in the medical school, all right, and knows perfectly well that that is a human being that he or she is killing. And also the politicians who allow for the law, the legalization, because they are also supposed to be knowledgeable people. The Library of Congress is supposed to be the largest Congress library in the world. There's no book, article, journal published on this world that is not accessible to the Library of Congress, okay, to the Congress men and women. So legislators are supposed to be very knowledgeable people. Anyway, let me get into the moral object itself. You can see how some of this argument is complicated, and we have to parse it out. We really, truly need to cut between joint and marrow, as Scripture says, right, to be able to make this analysis. But I can tell you that after doing the mental effort, we can do it. And the reward is that we will do an objective morality that allows us to say, this is objectively wrong, this behavior is wrong, without passing judgment on the conscience of the person. For example, in the case of Michael, Michael's infidelity objectively was wrong because he was still married to Terry. If he wants to move on, divorce Terry, let go of the inheritance, all right, and then start a new relationship. Anyway, the moral object tells us by the word itself that it is objective, and it answers the basic question of what? What is being done, all right? What is being done objectively? In other words, if we could almost take a an intellectual photographic image of the action, what is being done? And now here, the what, we have to be very careful not to be sarcastic about it, not to contaminate the act ethically. I'm going to give you an example. Two people, they're in front of each other, and one person is introducing a knife into the stomach of the other person. I know it's a graphic example, I apologize, but sometimes we have to use these in ethics to make a point, all right? So we're watching two people, and one person is introducing a knife into the stomach of the other person in front. And they're both dressed in civilian clothing, so they're not military, right? And we don't see the other person that is being victimized as aggressing the killer, all right? It's not that the other person is pointing a gun or is also has a knife in his hand. Let's say they're both men for the purpose of argument, keeping it simple. The victim doesn't have a knife in his hand that is trying to kill the other person who is, we could make the claim, possibly self-defense. From what we're seeing, the action is not self-defense. There's one person killing another person by knife, all right? Is stabbing another person to death. And so we can say that objectively, that action is wrong, that whatness is wrong. And describing the act is very important. Objectively, watching as a bystander, as a third person, watching these two persons interact, we can say that one person is murdering the other person, all right? Which is an unjust killing. because there is a type of just killing. A just killing would be if precisely if someone else is trying to put a knife into me, that I defend myself. And in the process of defending myself, I may actually end up killing the aggressor, all right? But that killing the aggressor is not murder, it's self-defense. And I'm protected by law, but I'm also protected ethically that I did not murder the aggressor. I defended myself, and I did kill the aggressor to stop the aggression. You can think of it also in case of rape, for example. The woman who is being raped has a right and a duty to defend herself, all right, against the aggressor, against the rapist, even to the point of killing the rapist. And that is not a murder, that is self-defense. Okay, but back to the case of the murder itself. What is to be avoided at all times is to be sarcastic about it. And for example, the killer, right, the murderer on trial maybe, when asked to describe his actions, of course, there is the thing that we cannot put the defendant on jeopardy and ask him the question, did you murder this other person, right? But let's say hypothetically, we could ask that question for ethical purposes, for the purpose of the ethical argument, right? And the murderer will say, oh no, I did not murder that person. Rather, my hand, my right hand, was inserting a sharp metal object into the abdominal region of this other person who was standing in front of me. Well, of course, this person, this murderer, is describing physically what is happening, you know, what his hand is doing. But when we take that whole phrase, that whole sentence into a single word, we can say that I am murdering the other person, because the other person is not attacking me, I'm not doing self-defense, you know, I'm murdering the other person. Maybe I want to rob the other person, or maybe I hate the other person, who cares what the intention is. Objectively, you know, if I am putting a knife into the belly of another person, and the other person is not attacking me, I am murdering the other person. Okay, that is the moral object. See, that is moral object, and that allows us, so it answers the question, what am I doing? And when we answer that question as honestly as possible and as objectively as possible, it allows us to conclude that certain actions are correct and certain actions are incorrect, morally, ethically speaking. Some actions are immoral always and anywhere, all right? And so people ask me, well, Professor, what are some examples of those actions of that intrinsic evil? And I say, well, the list of the 10 Commandments is a good start, right? Like, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not cheat, do not lie, for example. You know, lying is a grave evil. Lying is a grave evil. And yet people don't get arrested for lying unless they are under oath in a trial or something like that, or in deposition, and then that would be perjury. But outside of a legal scenario, unfortunately, people lie all the time. And it's a grave evil that should always be avoided. Not sometimes, you know, there are no necessary lies, okay? And always, when people have difficulty about that, I say, well, maybe sometimes it's necessary to lie to avoid a greater evil. And I ask the question, who of us ever likes to be lied to? See, no one likes to be lied to, all right? It's dishonest, it's fundamentally dishonest, and we should always avoid it. There's also something called reservation of confidentiality, you know, or confidentiality, that not everyone has a right to know everything about ourselves or about anything else, you know. So we have a right to remain silent, for example. In fact, that is what is told when someone is arrested. You know, we see it in movies, you have the right to remain silent. So we don't need to self-incriminate, and we don't need to say information that is confidential, all right? So we don't have the responsibility, the duty to say everything, all right? We can remain silent, but we certainly don't need to lie, because that is fundamentally dishonest and objectively an evil, a grave moral evil. So anyway, when we study the human behavior, ethically or morally speaking, right? Then we can parse it out like this into the three components, and we can determine what is being done objectively, and then we can pass judgment on that. Again, with regards to judgment, we see Jesus mentioning many times, do not pass judgment, do not judge, and you will not be judged, etc., all right? But in what sense does he mean that? He means do not judge the conscience of people, do not judge their motivation, their intention. But certainly, we need to judge the actions. So certain actions are right and certain actions are wrong. If we want to stick with the example of Jesus, even though he does say, do not judge and you will not be judged, when he was confronted with the adulterous woman, so she was caught in adultery. So objectively, she was doing something morally wrong, right? It was an intrinsic evil. She was caught in adultery, all right. He says to her, where are your, the people who were accusing you? Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you? And the woman replies, no one, sir. And then he says to her, nor do I condemn you, all right? Meaning I don't pass judgment on your conscience, all right? But he doesn't end there. He says, go and sin no more, all right? So he's passing judgment on her action, on the behavior, on the adultery. He's basically telling her, I don't condemn you either, all right? But do not commit adultery again, okay? Because adultery is an intrinsic evil. So he doesn't just say, nor do I condemn you, and stop there. No, he does pass judgment on her behavior. He says, sin no more. He doesn't say, go do it again, all right? So we have to understand, that's why I say the Bible, we cannot take literally, we have to interpret the passage. We have to see what it is that Jesus, that God wants to tell us through that passage. And we have to go deeper, precisely using our intellect, using our reason, and then apply it by using our will. Okay, so anyway, that's with regards to the forms of morality that allow us to make an objective ethics, an objective bioethics, and say this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, we should always avoid this kind of behavior, etc. Okay. All right, moving forward. Oh, okay, so each one of these slides looks at one, the moral object, the intentions, and the circumstances. Okay, so I see it's 10:30. I'm just gonna ask you, we have two more principles to go, probably another 40 minutes or so. You want to take a break now, or you want me to continue through? You tell me.
Continue through.
Continue, Chris, Rogelio?
Yes, continue.
Yeah, okay, going forward. You are the two who are present that I see anyway, so let's continue. All right, cooperation with evil, cooperation with evil. There are two ways that we can cooperate with evil. First of all, when we are cooperating with evil, it means that we're not the principal agent, all right? We're not the principal agent. In contrast to here, with the forms of morality, where we are the principal agent. We are the agent, and that answers the question, who? Who? For example, we can say that in the intentions is the who. Who is acting, right? And that's the principal agent. But in cooperation, we're not the principal agent, but we are cooperating with someone else or other people. It could be more than one person. We are cooperating. So for example, let's say in an abortion situation, in a procured abortion, I am not, the principal agent would be the abortionist. He's the one who's performing, or she's the one who's performing the abortion. Okay, but the nurses who are assisting in that abortion are cooperating somehow, are facilitating the process, all right? Or the person who took the pregnant mom to the abortion clinic is cooperating with the process, or the person who paid for the abortion, etc. So we can see cooperation. We're not the principal agent. We're not the principal agent, but we are facilitating the evil act one way or another. Okay? So how are we participating in that cooperation, and when is it licit, when is it ethical, and when it is unethical to participate in an evil act, all right? To facilitate an evil act, even when we're not the principal agent, the main agent performing the act. All right, again, for the purpose of study, we need to parse out the cooperation itself into two parts. We talk about formal cooperation and we talk about material cooperation, all right? Formal or material cooperation. Now, formal cooperation is with when the will is engaged, when the will is engaged. In other words, I desire, as a secondary agent, I desire the same will, the same thing that the principal agent is desiring. Now, the principal agent, the main agent, is desiring something evil. All right, for example, in physician-assisted suicide. Let's look at that end-of-life issue. It's a good example. Physician-assisted suicide. If we parse out that phrase, is the physician committing the suicide? Yes or no? What do you say? In physician-assisted suicide, is the physician committing the suicide, doing the suicide?
No, but he's helping.
Right, he's helping. So the physician is not killing himself or herself. It could be the medical doctor could be a man or a woman, all right? But the physician is not killing herself, right? Let's say that the doctor is a woman. She's not killing herself, so it's not suicide. But is it homicide? In other words, is she killing someone else? Well, it depends. The will, okay? So it is the patient who is killing himself or herself. It is Brittany Maynard who killed herself. She's the one who put the lethal drug into her mouth, all right? We can say no one forced her, even the husband who was lying next to her did not, well, who knows? I don't know if it was actually the husband who put the pills into her mouth or not, but let's assume he didn't. Brittany Maynard took the lethal dosage herself. Socrates took the lethal dosage himself. So that was the suicide there, all right? And that was the principal agent acting on something that was intrinsically evil. In other words, suicide. Even to this day, in the law books, suicide is illegal and is certainly immoral, unethical. The challenge with suicide is, of course, how do you prosecute the agent when the suicide was accomplished, right? Because now the agent is dead. The agent is the same as the victim. So there's a challenge there. And on that technicality, a number of suicide laws have been questioned, by the way, legally, because it's not enforceable if the act is accomplished. Anyway, that aside, legality aside, physician-assisted suicide, the doctor is not directly committing the suicide. It is the patient who is taking the lethal dosage. But the doctor prescribed the lethal dosage. You see, the doctor prescribed the lethal dosage because these are regulated substances. They're not over the counter. So they're regulated substances, and therefore the doctor needs to prescribe. It is his competence or her competence according to the license to practice that they have, which they acquired through completing medical school, all right? Now, so is the doctor in physician-assisted suicide cooperating materially, at least materially, because the doctor is writing the prescription, literally writing the prescription on a piece of paper or even sending it virtually to the pharmacy, all right? And so no question that the physician in physician-assisted suicide is cooperating materially. Now, is the doctor cooperating formally? The case is made that yes, the doctor, well, I would ask you again, sorry, gave it away. Do you think that a doctor who prescribes a lethal dosage is cooperating formally or not? Keep in mind that for formal cooperation, okay, the will is engaged. In other words, the will of the agent, of the secondary agent, in this case, the doctor, is engaged, desires the same as the principal agent. That's the definition of formal cooperation, that the will of the cooperator desires the same as the will of the principal agent. So what is the will of the, who is the principal agent, first of all, in physician-assisted suicide? Who is the agent? The person
The
committing
patient.
the act? The patient. The patient is killing himself, herself. Suicide, right? Okay. So the physician is not the principal agent, but the physician is cooperating. We say that the doctor cooperated materially by writing the prescription, all right? Did he cooperate formally or not? What do you think? Again, we have to use reason, okay? We have to use logical argument, not schizophrenic. Not schizophrenic, doesn't work. We cannot be sarcastic. We have to be rather reasonable and logical. What do you think? Is the doctor formally cooperating or not?
Yes.
Yes, because otherwise, why would he write a prescription that he doesn't intend the patient to take, right? When a doctor writes a prescription, that doctor intends for that patient to take that prescription, that medication. Otherwise, why write it? You know, the doctor can always say sarcastically, oh no, I didn't intend for the patient to take that medication. Yes, it's a lethal dosage, but the patient is free. The patient didn't have to take it. You know, why did the patient chose freely to take the medication? Yeah, sure they did, but you prescribed it, doctor. And why would you prescribe a lethal dosage if you do not intend your patient to take it, right? It's illogical, it's unreasonable. And therefore, we have to assume that the doctor, yes, is in formal cooperation because the doctor desires for the patient to take a lethal dosage in this case. All right? Okay. And so that's formal cooperation. Formal cooperation with evil should always be avoided. We're talking about an intrinsic evil, like suicide. All right?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think there will ever be a time where patients are able to make that decision and exclude the doctor so that the doctor isn't culpable for, you know,
Right.
for helping them commit suicide?
Well, in fact, yeah, and it's happening already, all right? For example, that's what Dr. Kevorkian wanted to do with his suicide machine, all right? Was that he put it online, he put the design online so that people would be able to kill themselves without having to engage a doctor in prescribing it. That was his intention precisely. In the case of his suicide machine, unfortunately, it did require someone to insert an intravenous line, all right? And I presume that most patients would be queasy about doing that unless they themselves are doctors or nurses and know how to introduce an IV, all right? So it would require at least the assistance of a nurse to insert the IV. But one can think of other cases. In fact, there are these suicide pacts that have been going on. Sometimes they kind of become fashionable among some teenagers in certain settings. Okay, and we have to be very careful about this, extremely careful, because in certain settings, the suicide pacts have become kind of popular among teenagers. And so they will go to the forest and kill each other, right? They will somehow get a hold of some kind of lethal substances or weapons, and they'll kill each other and so forth in packs in a mutual agreement that they have made. So there, one can conceive of scenarios when a person could kill themselves. Now, I want to make the distinction, Chris, which is this. When a patient has no hope of recovery and they're still conscious, like the example of Brittany Maynard, all right? She did have an option that was ethical. Instead of killing herself, she had the option precisely of going into either hospice or palliative care, whereby her pain would be mitigated, even to the point eventually of rendering her unconscious because of the increase in dosage. Let's say the increase in dosage of morphine to manage the pain by titration, right? In other words, the drip was increased in rate and so forth, so that at some point she would become unconscious, all right, to mitigate. But the idea there is to manage the pain. So they say in the lexicon, to kill the pain, not to kill the patient. And it comes down to dosage. To administer enough dosage of the morphine or the painkiller precisely to kill the pain. We know that at some point, that increase in dosage will eventually render the person unconscious, all right? But the idea is for the patient with a terminal illness to die from the terminal illness, from the progress of the cancer, of the brain cancer, which was extremely aggressive and would have killed her soon anyway. The brain cancer would have killed her because it would have invaded not only the cerebrum, but also the brain stem, thus stopping the heart, stopping the breathing, all right? And so the brain cancer would have killed her eventually, but she would have been unconscious, all right? And that would have been the ethical thing. That would have been allowing her to die because she had a terminal illness, but not killing herself, see? And that's where really, objectively speaking, that was the wrong act to do for her to take the lethal dosage. Again, not passing question on her, not passing judgment on her conscience. I think, in my opinion, my personal opinion, with regards to Brittany, I think her youth kind of got in the way, that perhaps she did not have the maturity yet that would have been necessary to deal with such a drastic, such a devastating diagnosis and the reality of brain cancer, of aggressive brain cancer, all right? But yes, the statement that she made tells me, in my opinion, in my analysis, that perhaps she was missing that maturity to make a better decision, which said, I wanted to kill the cancer, okay? I wanted to, no, not kill the cancer. I wanted to beat the cancer. I want to beat the cancer, all right? I want to beat the cancer so the cancer doesn't kill me. So she had kind of like a personal fight against the cancer. And she did not want the cancer to kill her, right? And so she ended up killing herself. In fact, there was, but that I can understand. That would have been, I would not blame her for that. I would have put that in ignorance, in inculpable conscience, all right? Inculpable conscience, I would have attributed to ignorance. Different from the state of Oregon. You know what is recorded as her reason for death in the state of Oregon? What do you think would be the cause of death for Brittany Maynard? Registered in the coroner's office, you know, in the state, officially in the records of the state of Oregon. What would be the official cause of death? Just looking at it at face value. Heart attack from lethal dosage, right? Remember, it's a two-step thing. She takes basically 2 pills. One pill will put her to sleep, and the other pill is an overdose of potassium chloride, which will precipitate a heart attack, all right? And she knows that, she knows that. So her cause of death was heart attack by lethal dosage, by overdose. Well, no. You know what's recorded in the medical record of the state of Oregon as a cause of death?
PAS.
The brain cancer.
Oh.
Brain cancer. Okay. But she did not die from the brain cancer. She did not die from the brain cancer. Okay. So that is what I considered fundamentally dishonest from the coroner's office in the state of Oregon, all right? Precisely to validate and to justify the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. So they did not want to put, essentially, that she killed herself, that it was suicide. She died from brain cancer. That's unethical. That's not acceptable, all right? But it's legal. So we have to be careful here. Not everything that is legal is ethical by any stretch of the imagination. All right, so this formal cooperation, if the will is engaged, then that means that the cooperator is as guilty, objectively speaking, as the agent who is performing that evil act, all right? They're both culpable ethically, morally. And now, material cooperation is a different thing. One may be in material cooperation without being in formal cooperation, all right? And that is when the will is not engaged. In other words, I am somehow engaged in the act, but I don't desire the evil that is being done. For example, you know, the cleaning person, the cleaning person on in the abortion clinic, right? Someone has to clean that operating room, all right, after hours. Someone has to go in there and clean that operating room so that it's clean for the next day, for the abortions of the next day. That person who is the cleaning person may be a pro-life person, may be totally against what is going on in that room, all right? But that person needs a job. And maybe this, for now, is the only job that they can get. And so they don't desire the abortions that go on there, but they need to do the best possible in cleaning the room. They need to clean that room to the best of their ability so that the next day the abortions go on in a clean environment, in a healthy environment, at least for the mother. And so that would be material cooperation, you see? Material cooperation. And so material cooperation is allowed for serious reasons, for serious, grave reason. The case that I gave would be that this is the only job that this person has for now, and maybe they need to maintain themselves, and even worse if they need to maintain a whole family. So they definitely need that job for now, all right? And so that's material cooperation. Then material cooperation can be parsed out further into immediate or mediate, all right? Immediate or mediate. And this has to do with how directly you can substitute mediate for direct, and immediate for direct, and mediate for indirect. Those are two words that can be substituted there. Immediate would be direct, and mediate would be indirect. Starts getting a little technical here, and maybe not necessary for most ethical analysis, but there is this distinction how closely the cooperation is to the original evil act, okay? And close is not necessarily by distance, by physical distance of inches or miles, and it's not necessarily either by time, you know, a few minutes or a few years, but rather ontological, the act in itself. How closely is the act? The case that I gave, for example, of the cleaning person of an abortion clinic is definitely not the, well, it could be considered direct in that this person is literally cleaning the room and the table and the bed where the abortion is taking place, all right? But it is remote in that the person is not engaging in that cleaning, let's say, while the abortion is going on. And so it is remote. Or it could be more at a distance, for example, but the distance is that it is removed from the actual act itself. It could be, you can push it further back. For example, the the agents that are used for cleaning the surgical instruments, all right? The people who clean the surgical instruments, which is going to be someone different from the custodian, right? We assume that it's not the custodian who's cleaning the room, who's also cleaning the surgical instruments. The surgical instruments would be cleaned, would be sterilized typically by a nurse or an assistant, a technician who knows how to sterilize surgical instruments, all right? So a different professional, a different person, and that person maybe is in material cooperation, the technician who is cleaning the surgical instruments that are being used by the abortionist, but that technician is in material cooperation, again, because they're cleaning the materials physically that are used for the abortion, but that technician may be a pro-life technician, and it is not engaged, it does not desire the abortions that is going there. And we can say, well, but that technician's task is necessary for the abortion to occur. It's necessary in a sense, yes. However, it is the only job for now that this technician could get, all right? Now, again, the implication here is that if this technician can get another job, all right, or clean some other instruments that are not involved in the abortion, let's say that the clinic also does other procedures there, maybe they just do a check to see the length of the pregnancy, the time of pregnancy for the woman, the stage of pregnancy, all right? They're using certain equipment, then that equipment needs to be sterilized. So it could be that the technician does not desire the abortion itself, but somehow is associated with the clinic, or the receptionist at the front desk, right? There's some level of material cooperation, but they don't desire the actual evil event, all right? That could be permitted for grave reason, because the will is not engaged, all right? I'll give you an example that is more to the point, precisely of the vaccine itself. We see that the 3 vaccines that are available in the United States for now are Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. I'm talking about the vaccine for coronavirus 19, all right? And so these vaccines have been developed, or at least tested, or with a cell line, a human cell line that is called HEK, H-E-K. Now we'll see this in more detail when we get to the healthcare bioethics course in the fall, but basically it's just an anticipation of how the principle of cooperation can be applied. This HEK line, H-E-K, stands for human embryonic kidney, all right? And human embryonic kidney, this is a cell line, it's an immortalized cell line that was developed decades ago. It's a little sketchy because back then no records were kept, or no records have been found exactly where, how the human embryo came about, all right? But basically it was a kidney from an abortion, has to be an abortion because they have an embryonic kidney, right? They have the kidney of a human embryo, so it had to be an abortion. What is in question is whether that abortion was a procured abortion or a spontaneous abortion, which happens. I've spoken before, I've said that approximately 50% of all human pregnancies never make it to term naturally in what we call a spontaneous abortion early on, or a miscarriage. So it's better to talk about a miscarriage that is later in the pregnancy, when the kidney was already formed. All right, so somehow it was about 50 years ago estimated that this HEK line has been in research for about 5 decades. And it's estimated that it was some abortion that happened in Scandinavia somewhere, possibly in the Netherlands, about 50 years ago. And an abortion happened, whether it was a procured abortion that was willed, or it was a spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. Subsequent to the abortion, some research lab obtained the kidney from this, the remains of this abortion, all right, from the fetus of this abortion. Now, the abortion itself is estimated that was not done for the purpose of developing the cell line. In other words, this abortion was not done for developing cell lines from the tissue of the human fetus, right? Most likely, if the abortion was procured, it was simply because the woman did not want to have that pregnancy, okay? Which in itself, objectively, is an evil act, but we've spoken enough about that. If it was a miscarriage, then there was no evil at all because it was an act of nature whereby the woman spontaneously lost the pregnancy. Now, it's less likely that it was a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage. Why? Simply because typically the vast majority of miscarriages or spontaneous abortion is because the embryo or the fetus has some kind of malformation, has some kind of genetic defect. And so that automatically disqualifies that tissue for developing a cell line, all right, for an immortalized cell line. So it's unlikely that it was a spontaneous abortion. Most likely the remains of spontaneous abortions of miscarriages, they're considered biological waste and they're incinerated, essentially. Excuse me, they're incinerated. Excuse me. Anyway, okay, but even in the case that it was a procured abortion, the abortion itself was not done for the purpose of developing the cell line. So already that is one step removed from the evil act, the intrinsic evil act of the abortion itself, or the procured abortion. All right, so it could be that the lab, the research lab that developed the cell line, the HEC cell line, human embryonic kidney, did not will the abortion. All right, they used the tissue, but they did not desire the abortion itself. So that already is one step removed from formally cooperating with that intrinsic evil act of the procured abortion. You follow? The intention of the lab was simply, of the researchers, was to develop a cell line, all right, to develop a cell line. Whether they should have used tissue from a procured abortion or not could be debated, all right? But it's conceivable to see that the persons who used that tissue did not necessarily desire the abortion itself, okay? It's conceivable to reason that way. However, there's even more remoteness in the case of the development of the vaccines, because now this HEC cell line, I can tell you, has been around for decades in many labs of the world. When I was studying at Purdue, I know that a number of labs use the HEC cell line for research purposes because it's a very stable cell line and it is human tissue. It's not actual, I mean, there's nothing left of the original tissue of the human embryo, okay? Or the human fetus. There's nothing left of that original kidney tissue or any other of that original tissue. This is a cell line that has derived from that original tissue, but that original tissue is now gone. So the cell line is a derivative. So that's already another step removed from the tissue. Sometimes people say, no, I'm not going to take this vaccine because they're going to be injecting the fetal tissue of an aborted baby into me. You know, they're injecting an aborted baby into my body, and that's repugnant to me. It's not that case at all. That's impossible to do with these cell lines, all right? Because that original tissue no longer exists. Anyway, the cell line is there, it's immortalized. So it's essentially similar to a cancer that grows uncontrollably and continues to grow and grow in Petri dish in the lab with the proper conditions of a culture medium and body temperature, the 37 degrees centigrade and so forth in incubators. And then when the plate reaches confluence, meaning that it's full of the cell of layer of these cells, they have to be passed on to another Petri dish or vial, and that's called passage. Precisely when they reach confluence, they need to be passed on from one vial or Petri dish to another. Otherwise, they become overcrowded, and then they all start dying because they'll deplete the nutrients and so forth. So it's a technique in the lab, and this has been going on for decades in many, many labs of the world. They can also be frozen, cryopreserved in liquid nitrogen and so forth, and preserved pretty much indefinitely. So it's an available source of human tissue that is out there for research and for even clinical trials, right? Well, prior to clinical trials themselves on live human beings. Pfizer and Moderna, according to their records that they have published and admitted, used the HEK cell line in preliminary trials to see if their technique of using messenger RNA was going to work or not, okay? So the HEK cell line was used by Pfizer and Moderna by their own admission in preliminary trials, not in the development of the vaccine itself, but in preliminary trials in this novel novel protocol that we're using for developing the vaccine, which was messenger RNA. The traditional development of a vaccine is by using either the attenuated virus or the killed virus or fragments of the virus itself and so forth. All right, that's the traditional way of developing a vaccine. And that's why it takes so long, typically 5, 10, 15 years to develop a vaccine under normal circumstances. Also because it's very expensive and there's not unlimited dollars to devote. It literally costs millions of dollars to develop a vaccine, okay? All right, so Pfizer and Moderna used the HEK cell line in preliminary studies, not in the development of the vaccine itself. That removes that cell line even more from the actual Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. According to their own claims, Johnson & Johnson, which did the traditional way of developing the vaccine, did use the HEK cell line further, not only in preliminary studies, but also in the actual production, in the development and production of the vaccine itself. So that engages Johnson & Johnson a little more with the HEK cell line. But even so, it's conceivable that these pharmaceutical companies did not desire in their conscience, in the development of the vaccine, they did not desire the original abortion, okay? So that puts them, again, removed from formal cooperation of the abortion itself. It might be considered material cooperation because they're using a derivative of the original abortion, assuming that the abortion was a procured abortion. Right? But you see how it's getting more and more remote from the original evil act. And so it could be material cooperation. One could make the argument for material cooperation, especially perhaps Johnson & Johnson, a little bit more than Pfizer or Moderna. But even so, that cooperation may be allowed, again, for the grave reason. And what is the grave reason? The grave reason is that the virus can kill me, all right? The virus can kill me, and therefore there's a certain obligation that I have as steward of my own life to protect. If there is a medication, if there is a vaccine that can help me prevent the virus from killing me, then there's a certain level of responsibility to take that medication, to take that vaccine for myself, and further for the people who surround me. Right? Because if I am vaccinated and I get infected, then that virus dies within me. But if I am not vaccinated and I'm infected, especially because of the incubation period of about 5 to 7 days, I may be infecting other people and I don't realize it because I'm asymptomatic. I don't have any symptoms necessarily, but I'm infected and infecting other people. So there's that responsibility, you see? Again, the grave reason is that it can kill myself. Plus, as a receiver of the vaccine, right? I'm at the end of the line, I'm at the end of the production line as user of the vaccine. So I am very, very, very removed from the original evil act of the procured abortion, if it happened to have been a procured abortion, 50 years ago in the Netherlands, all right? And therefore is at most remote material cooperation with an evil act, which again is permitted for a grave reason, the grave reason being that the virus can kill me, and also trying to get to herd immunity as soon as possible. That means 70% of the population, and we allow just infection to get to 70% of the population. In the United States, we're 330 million people approximately, and 70% of that is about 270 million people, 230 million people that need to get infected, all right, without the vaccine. So the vaccine certainly brings that number down dramatically. So that's the point there. And I think that the case of the coronavirus vaccines is an excellent example to see cooperations and the limit of cooperation, and the fact that material cooperation is allowed for grave reason, and therefore it's an excellent principle to use in bioethics, okay? All right, any questions there? I probably elaborated a little too much more than necessary. We'll cover it again, so I'm going here step by step. Like I said, we'll cover this case again in the fall when we look at healthcare bioethics, but at least now you have the background to it, all right? Now, before leaving the topic of cooperation, there is a difference between individuals and institutions with regards to cooperation, all right? There is an ethical difference because whereas it may be licit, it may be ethical for individuals to engage in material cooperation with evil, it may not be licit for institutions to engage in material cooperation with evil when that evil is indeed a grave evil because of the possibility of scandal, all right? The possibility of scandal. We should always avoid scandal. So scandal is an intrinsic evil. We should never be participants in scandal, in scandalizing, in leading other people into error or leading other people into committing some evil act or thinking evil, all right? That is scandal. When my behavior leads other people, scandalizes other people, leading them to think evil or to actually engage in that evil. Why? Well, because if Father is doing it, it cannot be all that wrong, right? If the Supreme Court allowed it, it cannot be all that wrong, right? Well, that's a scandal. That's the big scandal of the United States for the past 50 years is the legalization of abortion, for example. And now the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. That is really scandalous. It is disedifying many, many people, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. And then, of course, there's the copycat syndrome. If it happens in the United States, then it must be good, and other people automatically start copying it, other parts of the world, simply because we do it, and we are supposed to be the best, right? And therefore, other people copy not only the good things, but the bad things that are being done in American society. All right, so we look at the institution because the institution has a public image, right? And it's out there in the public, right? They have a responsibility not to engage in intrinsic evil. And I point this out, it's one of the directives actually with regards to beginning of life issues in the ERDs. You will see that Catholic institutions may not participate or engage in material cooperation with abortion, for example, mentions that specifically, okay? Material cooperation with abortion. In other words, a Catholic institution, there's no good intention in a Catholic institution, in a Catholic healthcare institution, meaning a Catholic hospital, a Catholic nursing home or healthcare facility, there is no good intention that a Catholic institution could possibly have to engage materially, not formally, but materially with a procured abortion, all right? Meaning that for the reason of scandal, because then in the eyes of the public, it's understandable that many people don't make the distinction between formal and material cooperation. Many people have not had the luxury of taking this course or engaging in philosophy and understanding the distinctions, the fundamental distinctions between formal and material cooperation. So they will think naturally, oh, if a Catholic hospital is engaged in an abortion, all right, or for example, in vitro fertilization, which again is an intrinsic evil, as we covered in the course of beginning of life. If a Catholic hospital is somehow associated with in vitro fertilization or with abortion, then it may give the impression that the Catholic hospital now, or the Catholic Church, is now approving those procedures. And so it may be a reason for scandal, a cause for scandal, and therefore that has to be avoided. What I'm trying to say by all this is that the standard for institutions, the ethical standard, is higher than the standard for individuals. Because whereas if I engage in material cooperation with evil, you know, I may scandalize possibly some people who know me around me. I'm talking as a private individual, as a private citizen, but I will not scandalize a whole society, all right? But an institution, a Catholic institution like a hospital or a Catholic nursing home may indeed scandalize a whole group of people, a large group of people, which is not right, not fair, and therefore needs to be avoided. So what I'm saying is that the standard for institutions is going to be somewhat higher with regards to material cooperation when we talk about grave moral evil like abortion or in vitro fertilization or physician-assisted suicide in the case of end of life. All right. Okay, moving forward, let's see. We have one last principle, which is double effect. It's now 11:20. Probably about, can do this about 20 more minutes. You tell me, you want a break or should we keep going?
I'm good to keep going.
Yeah. I'm good for another 20 minutes if you want. It's okay?
If you guys want to take a break, it's no problem. It's not.
All right.
I'm good either or.
Okay, if you people need to take a little small individual break, go ahead on your own. It's being filmed anyway, so you know that's happening. Okay, so let's look at this third principle, which is double effect. Again, this one is used a lot in bioethics and especially in healthcare bioethics. It's not the only principle. In fact, it's used so much in healthcare bioethics that some people think it's the only principle that we use in healthcare bioethics, but it's not. All right, the other two, for example, are also used quite a bit, but this one is a very useful, very practical principle. Double effect, which means that from a single action, two effects flow simultaneously. All right, now you need to think about this a little bit to have a mental picture. Two effects flow simultaneously from a single action. Not sequentially, one after the other, but simultaneously, the act as a whole, all right? The act as a whole. For example, the removal, what we call sapingostomy, the removal of the fallopian tube that is pregnant, all right? A pregnant mom who has an ectopic pregnancy. Ectopic pregnancy, in other words, the embryo lodged, embedded, implanted into the fallopian tube, which is definitely the wrong place to be. As that embryo continues to grow, that embryo will burst the fallopian tube and cause massive hemorrhage, can kill the mother. So it's life-threatening. In principle, ectopic pregnancy is life-threatening. Thanks be to God. Remember, we saw it providentially. Nature has a way of taking care of this, and most ectopic pregnancies resolve on their own, meaning that eventually the fallopian tube is able to dislodge that embryo and pass it down, pass him or her down, sorry, and that would be a spontaneous abortion, okay? But for the pregnancies that don't dislodge, that don't resolve spontaneously, as it said, all right, naturally, then it's a urgent issue, it's a critical issue, it has to be addressed right away, and that's why the woman, the mom with an ectopic pregnancy is monitored expectant monitoring, all right? Observation, expectant observation. And if the pregnancy continues, then there has to be an intervention. The salpingostomy, which is the removal of the tube, the fallopian tube. Obviously, they're removing the tube that is implanted with the embryo. They're not going to remove the other tube that is healthy, right? They're removing the tube that is implanted. And so that implantation makes that tube pathological. This is very important to understand the clinical aspect, all right? The diagnosis of an ectopic pregnancy, the diagnosis is that the fallopian tube has a pathology, all right? Is diseased, is sick, is ill by the pregnancy itself, because the pregnancy doesn't belong there. Specifically, if you want to get even more specific, is the embedding of the placenta. In other words, it's called the trophoblast, is the outer lining of the blastocyst, remember? And the trophoblast embeds and begins to develop the placenta. It's called the syncytial trophoblast. It's too technical, but the point is that as the trophoblast of the blastocyst is invading the tissue of the fallopian tube, it is seeking to establish a capillary connection with the mother, with the tissue of the mother, namely the placenta. And so that placenta is pathological, all right? It's considered a disease of the fallopian tube because the fallopian tube cannot sustain that pregnancy. It is the uterus that is designed anatomically and physiologically to sustain the pregnancy. That's why it's thickened, becomes spongy, and so forth. The endometrium, the uterus, the wall, the inner lining of the uterus. All right, so now we have a pathology. And the pathology can be addressed by excising, by taking out that tube that has become pathological. Okay? That's the salpingostomy. Okay, and so we have two simultaneous effects. The good effect is that the pathology ends by taking out the segment of the tube and then reconnecting the tube or ligating it. There are a couple of options there, but if the tube is reconnected, then the technician has to sew the tube back together, all right? It's called anastomosis, little tiny curved needles with thread that have to sew that little tube back together through a process called anastomosis. It's delicate and so forth, and the chance of that, the challenge of that is that it may create scarring tissue where the subsequent pregnancy can get stuck there again, all right? But anyway, that's the standard procedure. The negative effect, so two effects are happening from this intervention, from removing the tube. The good effect is that the health of the mother is restored, right? The health of the mother is restored, so she's no longer at risk of dying from massive hemorrhage. The negative effect is that the embryo will die. The embryo will die because the embryo is inside the tube, and once that tube is excised, that will become medical waste, which will typically be incinerated, all right? And so as the tube is incinerated, the embryo inside the tube is also going to be incinerated and will die. The embryo is not being killed directly. And that's the difference between salpingostomy and salpingectomy, going in and scraping out the embryo, all right? That is attacking the embryo directly, you see? And so it's very subtle, but very real. The principle of double effect allows for the removal of the tube with the embryo inside, but does not allow the scraping of the embryo itself because that is a direct intervention on the embryo. Whereas the removal of the tube is a direct intervention on the tube, on the fallopian tube itself, okay? And so it's subtle. Some people just don't see it, have a lot of difficulty seeing this, and we know that the embryo is going to die, but the embryo is not being killed directly. If these 5 principles, if these 5 conditions hold for double effect. All right, so principle of double effects allows for a bad or negative effect to flow simultaneously out of a good effect. If these 4 conditions, or 5, I put 5 in parentheses because we can look at this as the first, it is the last resort, first of all. It is the last resort. In other words, if there is another procedure that is more benevolent, that does not have the negative effect, then obviously that other procedure should be chosen, right? And so it's implied when we go into double effect that this is the last resort. There is no other protocol that is more benevolent than this one, okay? And that's why it's put into parentheses. And typically you will see only 4 conditions for the principle of double effect, which are these first 4. All right, so let's go through them. The act in itself must be morally good or neutral. Okay, what is the act of a salpingectomy? Is to, am I getting these two, I get these two confused. So let me just speak here for a moment and cheat. Salpingectomy. Surgical, yeah, salpingectomy. I said salpingostomy originally, I was wrong. The salpingostomy is the scraping out of the embryo, all right? But salpingectomy is to eject, you can look at it this way, is to eject the tube. So salpingectomy is cutting out the tube that is pathological, that has been invaded by tissue from the embryo that should not be there. So the act in itself is good or neutral. It's more than neutral. It's good because the intention here is to restore the health of the mother. Okay, to restore the health of the mother, to prevent a hemorrhage. And so the act itself is good. Now, the evil effect must not be directly willed. This has to do with the, okay, so this first one has to do with the moral act itself, all right? By removing the tube, we're not, let's say, killing the mother, we're not harming the mother. Keep in mind that the reproductive organs are as important as they are, they're not vital organs. So people can live without the reproductive organ, all right? And can have a fulfilled, meaningful life without the reproductive system. So certainly removing one tube is not an evil act in itself, all right? It's actually neutral or good, in this case, by saving the life of the mother. So that's with regards to the moral object. The intention, right, has to do with the will. The evil effect was not be willed. In other words, as I am removing, let's say that we are the surgeons and we are removing that tube with the little embryo inside. I am not willing to remove the embryo. I do not desire to remove the embryo. That's why I'm not doing a salpingostomy. All right, if I were desiring to remove the embryo by himself or herself, then I would do a salpingostomy, but not a salpingectomy. So the fact that I'm doing a salpingectomy when I have a salpingostomy as an option, as a clinical option, is speaking to the fact that I do not will to take out only the embryo or to act on the embryo or to kill the embryo. All right, so the will is clean, is a good will, which is to save the life of the mother. This is life-threatening. It's not just cosmetic, you know, it's not that she's going to look prettier, it's life-threatening. So the evil effect is not willed. Third, that the good effect was not flow directly from the evil effect. Okay, so in other words, the restoring, here we have to, again, keep in mind the clinical setting. As a doctor, as surgeons, we're trying to restore the health of this patient, right? Removing a pathological tube restores the health of the patient. And so what is restoring the health of the patient is removing the tube. And therefore, the fact that the embryo is also removed and the embryo is going to die in itself is not the cause of restoring the health of the mother. Restoring the health of the mother is the fact that I'm removing the tube that is pathological. So therefore, number 3 also applies to an ectopic pregnancy. The good effect does not flow directly. The key word here is directly. It may flow indirectly because when I remove the tube, I'm also removing the embryo inside who is causing the pathology, but not directly, all right? And so the good effect is brought about by the removal of the tube itself. And therefore, it complies with the third condition. Finally, proportionality. Proportionality is also very important because here is life for life. In other words, the removal of that tube is not a cosmetic thing for the mother or a minor thing for the mother. It's not just, say, removing some pain, which typically ectopic pregnancies do bring some pain eventually, and that is precisely one of the key symptoms, right? And the pain will be on the side. Sometimes the pain generalizes, but typically it's on the side, you know, similar to appendicitis or something like that. So it's not just, let's say, removing pain or removing discomfort that this bothers me a little bit or like a mole on the skin, all right? No, it is the life of the mother, because if that ectopic pregnancy does not resolve on its own, if the little embryo is not pushed out of the fallopian tube and continues to grow there, that will rupture the tube. You can imagine a tube is not made, they're tiny. They're not made to sustain a pregnancy, okay? And so sooner or later, that tube is going to burst and cause a massive hemorrhage. So it's the very life of the mother that is at risk here. And so it's life for life. It's also the life of the embryo who will die inside that tube, okay? It's life for life. So if the risk is grave, then the effect also, if the effect is grave, the risk also has to be proportionately grave, all right? And so that's proportionality. And I mentioned finally that it is certainly the last resort, otherwise we wouldn't be using that procedure. We would use a more mild benevolent procedure that doesn't have an evil effect or as drastic as this one, which is the foreseen, undesired, but foreseen death of the embryo. So that's double effect. Then here again in the next slides, I go one line by line, which I should have done when I was talking about it. But that's double effect. And again, it's used quite a bit in biomedical ethics because it applies in many cases with the health, how grave is the health issue, right? What is the diagnosis? How serious is that diagnosis for the patient? Okay, folks, so these are the three principles, the fonts or the sources of the moral act, of the ethical act, then the cooperation with evil, and the principle of double effect. I've listed at the end, the last slide here is some references that you can look up. Part 3 of the Catechism, which is the ethical or moral part of the Catechism, including an analysis of the 10 Commandments. Then some encyclicals by Pope John Paul II, Veritatis Splendor, the Splendor of Truth, written in 1993. And then Faith and Reason, written in 98. Well, another one that would apply here also is the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae, written also by John Paul II. And then one by Pope Benedict in 2009, a little more recently, Caritas in Veritate, the truth in charity, speaking the truth in charity or with charity, all right? by Pope Benedict the 16th. Also the ERDs, the whole of part 6 of the ERDs, of course, are a great resource for the application of these principles. Okay, friends, that's it. That's all I have then for today. You have been, again, very patient and attentive to this. I know it's been a little bit on the philosophical side, but tried to give some examples as we go along. But these principles are very useful and applicable in bioethics, certainly when we talk about principled bioethics, right? These are some of the main principles that are used in principled bioethics. All right. Questions, comments, anything? We're going to have a break for weeks, and then we'll start again in the summer. I think is it the third? I think it's the third week of May. Let's see if I wrote it down for a moment. Well, before I talk about that, so I can close the recording. Any questions or comments?
I have a question, but it's not. Well, it is in regards to the lecture, but it's not at the same time.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's more so on how to go about journal writing. Like, is there how to journal for dummies type of thing?
Oh, journal writing, okay.
Yes.
Your own journal, yes, okay. So there are also scientific journals. So writing for a scientific journal would be a scientific article, which has its own rigor and protocol to follow. But journal writing is more personal, like your own journal, right?
Well, for a scientific journal.
Oh, you mean writing an article for a scientific?
Yes.
Writing a paper. Typically we call it a paper, which is a scientific article for a scientific journal. Yeah, well, that has certainly more rigor to it. And a good guide would be simply just to look at an article from a journal, any journal that is, many journals have a public access. Look at any scientific journal that you may be interested in, and just look at one of those articles, read one of those articles. It typically has 4 or 5 parts. It has an introduction, then the materials and methods that are described, the results that were obtained from the experimentation, then an analysis of the results, and finally conclusions. So those are typically the 5 parts of a scientific paper. Then of course the references at the end. So it's pretty much established. They tend to be very summarized and compressed. So the language sometimes is challenging in the sense that it's very much the technical language in field, and that language can get very technical indeed. So it depends on really the journal, and it depends on the field.
Okay.
But those are, my suggestion would be just start by reading a scientific article, and then you take it from there.
All right, got it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Oh, and also another question, sorry.
Sure, no problem.
You happen to know the next time?
Sorry, the next what? For some reason it cut out. Maybe the internet is a little slow.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear now, Chris. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Wanted to know when the next time it is that you'll be doing the cleaning of the forest.
Ah, yes, right. Okay, so we're in there basically through the summer. I'm going to be there, and
okay.
the following week also I'll be there.
Okay.
So you can just send me an email individually, and I can tell you. But basically, I'm there usually between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. more or less, Monday through Friday. Okay, because and then in June we'll start what is called the Summer Research Institute, but that's for undergraduates who are here on campus, and they come. My work would be in the field, in the forest, but that's for undergraduates. But you can send me an email, and we'll arrange the details if you're interested in doing some experience here.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Okay, I'm gonna end the recording now so that I can start downloading it. But in the meantime, let me see.